On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, festival producer Team Arts, and the British Library, we welcome you to this session of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our next session is the Partition Voices. Kavita Puri, Sam Dalrymple, and Vazira Fazila-Yacoobali Zamindar in conversation with Aanchal Malhotra. Kavita Puri's father was 12 when he found himself one of the millions of Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims caught up in the devastating aftermath of a hastily drawn border. For 70 years, like so many, he remained silent about the horrors he had seen. When her father finally spoke out, opening up a forgotten part of Puri's family history, she was compelled to seek out the stories. Determined to preserve these accounts of the end of empire and the difficult birth of two nations, Puri records a series of remarkable first-hand testimonies revealing partition's enduring legacy. In Partition Voices, she helps break the silence and confronts the difficult truths at the heart of contemporary South Asia with Vazira, author of the Long Partition and the Making of Modern South Asia, Refugees, Boundaries, Histories. Sam Dalrymple, co-founder of Project Dastaan, a peace-building initiative that aims to revisit partition memories and examine the impact of forced human migration through virtual reality. And Aachal Malhotra, author of Remnants of a Separation, a history of the partition through material memory. Kavita Puri works in BBC Current Affairs and is an award-winning TV executive producer and radio broadcaster. Her landmark three-part series, Partition Voices for BBC Radio 4, won the Royal Historical Society's Radio and Podcast Award and its overall Public History Prize. Sam Dalrymple is the co-founder and operations lead of Project Dastaan. He is currently writing a book about the breakup of the Indian subcontinent from 1937 to 1971. Vazira is an associate professor of history at Brown University and author of the Long Partition and Making of South Asia, Refugees, Boundaries, Histories. Her recent writings on the partition of 1947 include Why the Partition is Not an Event of the Past and Exile, Statelessness, and the Tenacity of Nostalgia. Vazira would also like to thank Vasi Artists Association, Karachi, for their support. Aachal Malhotra is an oral historian and author of Remnants of Partition, 21 Objects from a Continent Divided, shortlisted most recently for the British Academy's 2019 Nayaf Al-Rodham Prize for Global Cultural Understanding. All our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Do follow our handles, JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, please log back on london.jlflitfest.org or find us on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Please do comment by typing in the comment section. And last but not the least, please help keep JLF London at the British Library a free festival by donating generously. Ladies and gentlemen, the Partition Voices. Kavita Puri, Sam Dalrymple, and Vazira in conversation with Aachal Malhotra. Over to you, Aanchal.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very interesting panel on the 1947 partition of India. I have with me three very different scholars sitting in different parts of the world at the moment as well. And what is really, I think, compelling about this event is that all three of them, actually all four of us, are oral historians. And we all challenge the widely accepted notion of what partition is. often we find that partition is painted with a very uniform brush of violence. And those of us who study it in nuance and detail know that that isn't the case. And I'm really happy here that all of my three panelists have studied it through a very different and very, very nuanced lens. So I'm excited to get started on this. One thing I want to say is that though this is going to be a conversation led by me, I would love my panelists to also ask questions, because I think a lot of our subject matter is quite similar. So without further ado, let's talk about the beginning of all of your projects. Kavita, Sam, Vazira, you've all written very different books on the partition of India, but I know personally that books about partition usually start from very personal anecdotes. So maybe we could go Vazira, Kavita, and then Sam.
Sounds good.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank JLF and all of you for including me in this conversation, and also Vassal, the Artists Association here in Karachi, for orchestrating the space for me to be here. I am from a divided family, and for the last 2 weeks, my mother's sister in Pune, who is deaf and has been facing eviction there, and my mother here in Karachi has been on WhatsApp every day, talking to her landlord in Pune, to brokers in both Pune and Mumbai, to cousins, to friends and friends' friends, trying to stop her eviction, trying to find her another apartment, trying to arrange the kinds of help that she needs. And the fact that we cannot go there to be with her, to help her, or that she cannot come to live with her sister for the remainder of her years, it's not just heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking, but it's not just heartbreaking. It is a political condition. It is a political condition that I need to understand, and that never goes away. And it's a political condition that needs to be undone, and that never goes away. So that is where my work comes from, and my continued thinking with partition.
And I think it's quite aptly titled also The Long Partition, because what you talk about was not just felt in 1947 or 71 or with any event of such magnitude, but it continues on in the very everyday. As you say, they're on the phone right now. You know, this is very much their everyday. I think one thing that really got to me when I was doing my field research is divided families. The fact that when someone dies or when someone is born or someone is married, you can't cross the border. Kavita, we've had tons of conversations about Partition Voices, and in Britain it is not only well known, but it has kind of redefined the landscape of the year 1947, conversations on empire and personal history, the importance of personal history. And your book, of course, comes from an extremely personal place. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So, I mean, like with so many people that study partition, it was personal for me. My dad lived through that time, but never spoke about it. And I always tried to get him to talk to me about it, but he wouldn't. And as we approached the 70th anniversary in 2017, I thought not just of my dad, but all of that generation that came to Britain. And what's really interesting is a lot of people who lived through partition chose to, having become refugees, chose to make a dual migration to Britain. They came to Britain with their stories of loss and trauma, but they didn't talk about it. And so silence has pervaded partition memories in Britain for so long. And it kind of makes sense, really, that they didn't talk about it, because they were just trying to get on with life. They were looking forward. They didn't have time to look at the past. And then they had children like me who were born here, and we didn't know that much about life back home. So we didn't ask those questions. And these are difficult things to talk about. They had seen awful things, maybe things that happened in their family. There was much dishonor, shame. These are hard things to speak of. But within Britain, you say, you talk with great ease about partition. Partition is not something that is well known. we're not taught it in schools. There is a silence, an institutional silence when it comes to partition, and actually when it comes to empire. And so there was no public space for people to talk about these stories. And so, of course, my search was to hear my dad's story, but it was also to hear all those stories of people in Britain who had gone through that very traumatic time. These are British people. They were born subjects of the Raj. They're now British, and British people should know who they live side by side with, because this is a story, of Britain. And so that's what compelled me. And just, I thought, if we don't capture them now, it's 70 years on, they're so old. That's it, they're gone. They're gone forever from our family archives, but from the historical archives too. And that's why I chose first person testimony.
Sam, this of course is a very special event for you, because not only are you the co-founder of Project Dastaan, but you're also working on a new book, which I've had the fortune of reading the proposal. And again, it looks at partition through a completely different lens than any of us here as well. So what I want you to tell the audience is why Project Dastaan, first of all. You grew up in Delhi, and you're really immersed in the Indian landscape. So why Project Dastaan, and how during the lockdown did it inspire you to do something completely new on partition?
Yeah. So I first visited Pakistan in 2015 with remarkable ease, applied for a visa in Delhi, and it had always been this kind of other. I didn't really know what it was going to be like. And I went, and I was struck upon coming back with just, how the disbelief that, everything about every single thing that I was saying about Pakistan, this happened. And there was just this complete disconnect between any dialogue between the two sides. And when I was at university, we realized, there was such a big diaspora from both India and Pakistan. And everyone was talking about how their grandparents really wanted to cross that border. And we realized that with modern technology, we could find people's houses, childhood homes, childhood communities, without actually having to go there physically. And with a couple of people who could go across the border, and with teams on all sides of the borders, we were making virtual reality experiences for the partition generation of where they came from across the border. Now, when lockdowns hit, that all got put on hold. As in, Project Dastaan was still doing interviews, but it had to be, we couldn't travel anymore. We couldn't go out and find these places. We couldn't find the small pind in Punjab or the mohalla in Delhi that, was never on Google Maps. There wasn't a street view for kind of, this village in 10 hours outside of Lucknow. And so whilst in lockdown, I began reading much more about basically the geographical diversity. I became very, very struck with this one simple thing, which was the story of partition in Tripura in India's northeast. And I felt that so much of what we hear about partition is very specific to the Punjab, the huge massacre and the exchange of population, essentially. But as I think everyone has separately talked about, that kind of stuff was quite specific to the Punjab. And the experience of partition in Bengal, in the northeast, in Sindh, and also in places like Tamil Nadu and Kerala. I know, Vazira, you end your book by talking about some Malayalis who end up in Karachi and find this whole community of people from Kerala who are living in Karachi post-partition. And that kind of story, I found very little about these geographically varied partitions. And so my book is essentially talking about the different geographies of partition, the fact that it was affecting places in the northeast and in Tamil Nadu, where there was a sea border before you could get to anywhere across the British Empire, and places like Burma, Rangoon had 70% Indian population, Tamils, and all of that ended with partition, just like the land border, but in different ways. And so I wanted to talk a bit about that. And yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
When you're talking, it reminds me of how Vazira actually starts her book by saying that in our part of the world, the piece of land that has no name disappears. And maybe I'm misquoting you, and maybe I'm just paraphrasing it, but that's kind of how it starts, right? And Sam, I've seen you at work, I've seen you with Project Dastaan, and what I guess one of the things I love about the project so much is that it actually gives onus back to the people, it gives history back to the people. They have ownership over where they came from, because now they can see the streets and the names and everything. We're going to talk a little bit more about your book later, which I have many interesting questions about. But actually, one question I have for Vazira and Kavita, both in different aspects, because your geography that you talk about is very different. What about this sense of silence that exists within people? Vazira, I know you did very specific kinds of interviews in the cities of Delhi and Karachi. And Kavita, of course, you've traveled across the UK talking to people, and you both talk about the silences and why there is silence. Right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that in regards to your research? Maybe Kavita could start and then Vazira could follow.
It's really interesting, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because somebody asks me, and this is the thing I'm asked the most when I do events like this, is often, interestingly, third generation, and I think it's the same for Sam. I think it's third generation that approaches Project Dastaan to connect their grandparents. They ask, how do I interview my grandparents, sometimes my parents? And it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because like my dad, it took 7 decades for him to talk, and I always approached very, very gently with him, because I knew it was something that, you know, I couldn't really broach, and he didn't really want to talk. And what I have learned is that there are silences for so many reasons. Some of the things I talked about earlier, just because they were so busy getting on with their lives, but just because they didn't talk about it doesn't mean that they didn't think about it. And I think that you can have conversations within families, which might be fragments of stories, and you don't have conversations within a wider sphere, because as I talked about the institutional silence, it doesn't really exist. But what I've also come to realize is that sometimes there are silences that you can't touch. And I found that particularly with women who talking about sexual violence, and these silences are so profound and so deep that I don't think in Britain we will hear those stories now. But there's something else about silence which I've been thinking about, and it's about borders, and it's about memory and nostalgia. And when a border is drawn, I think that people think that stories and history and memories are erased, and they're not. They still live in the person's head, even if they don't speak it. And that's why I'm such a proponent of people talking to family members, because if you don't hear their story, which by the way is your family story, then it's gone forever, and that silence always remains. And I think that you should try and speak to family members about their story, because otherwise that's it, it's gone. And then you don't know. And I would say particularly for British South Asians, knowing your history really matters, because, you know, my tie to Britain is one generation only. That's quite fragile. And then I discovered that I am not just, you know, I have a connection to India, I have a connection to Pakistan too. And that really matters. And so I think we have to broach carefully. And I was really careful that we never spoke to any interviewees who didn't want to be spoken to. So we were always had generally an approach by a family member. But I think that we have to try and break those silences, and we have to try and do that carefully. And I think beyond the family in Britain, it really matters, because this is British history, and it's just about knowing who we live side by side with. And it's our connected history. And so, you know, it matters.
No, I think it's not just about the silence within the South Asian community, but also education within the larger British community as well, right?
Exactly.
As we see South Asian Heritage Month and stuff trying to start.
Yeah.
I think, do you mind if I just quickly jump in here? But I think it's also what you talk about a lot in your book, Kavita, is it's not just, you know, British South Asians whose history it is. You know, 1 in 20 people in the UK have some link to India, some through blood, but some, like my own grandfather, who was, you know, pulled into the war as a young officer and then was stationed out in Delhi. And so I've now lived in Delhi for my whole life. My parents moved here more or less in the 80s. But in that time, my grandfather never once visited us. And, you know, we didn't really realize that, like, we kind of knew that he had some connection to it, but it was only the day before his funeral that we found in some closet his photo album from 1947. And there was like a table plan where, you know, Jinnah and Nehru were both there, and he was the young officer at the end of the table. And he had an invitation to the flag raising of Pakistan. And there's a photo of him outside the Qutb Minar 20 minutes from my house. But in these 30 years, he never visited our family once. And I think that's, like, a lot of his friends died during partition. He saw some horrific things aged 18. And I think that the silence persisted through even, you know, a white British family who since found their home there.
It's so interesting you say that. And it's why I included British Voices, because I wanted to show that history. But when my Radio 4 series came out and the book came out, I talk about the breaking of silence within the British South Asian community, but you wouldn't believe how many British people then told me my dad was born in India, or, you know, I had a grandfather. And so I think also that the British population felt they had permission also to talk about their history and share that history too. And it's interesting you also talk about the British Indian Army or British Army who witnessed a lot of the massacres of partition, who came back and subsequently never talked about it either. And that's the thing, is because in Britain there is no conversation about empire or end of empire, nobody, whether British South Asians or British people, feel that they can speak with ease about it.
Yeah.
If I may jump into this conversation, thinking about silence and people sharing their oral histories, I mean, that's something that began when it began with a number of, you know, feminist scholars beginning to speak to their mothers and grandmothers, and then grappling with those stories. A lot of that silence, I think, as you've said, it was painful to speak about, and it has taken many generations to grapple with it. But I would say this, that even, especially growing up in a divided family where you could never, every conversation at home somehow had to grapple with this political fact, which was painful and difficult, and a lot of people didn't speak publicly about it, but there was a lot of at-home conversation about partition. I think for all our families, there was this sense that there was a kind of loss, an unspoken loss, that was integral part of each of us, even though we are a generation, maybe 2 generations removed from 1947 per se, or for the longue durée that it unfolded over. Even though we are generations apart from it, that sense of loss, that there was something integral within us that was missing, that had been taken away, that something had been denied to us, was very much deeply felt, deeply experienced. And this sense of loss, I think, is something that I feel is really important to hold on. A lot of people will say, stop talking about partition, enough. I mean, you're saying that there's still a lot of silence, but there's a lot of people who also say they're fed up with this partition memory business, remembering this terrible past. Enough has been said. We're telling more and more stories of the same event. We need to move on. We need to stop mourning this past. We need to stop mourning this past, and we need to sort of get settled with the facts on the ground. There's much to celebrate. 3 nation states are a reality. We need to move on, and that this is a past that needs to be left in the past. We've done enough storytelling about it. Now it's sort of we are in repetition mode. More and more stories. What is the new insight that they can offer? But it's this loss, I think. It's this sense of mourning that is so important to hold on to. Because this past is not in the past. Because this past is not in the past. It lives with us, in us, over time and over generations. And our own refusal to let go of this loss, it's taken me a really long time, really. I mean, I began work, it's been 25 years of collecting stories and the visual record of the years, what I think of as not something that ended in 47 or even 65 or 71, but one that sort of goes on. Partition is something that goes on and on and on. And I think holding on to this idea, this sense of loss, refusing to accept that partition is something that happened, it's over, we need to just get past it, is perhaps the same reason why Gandhi refused partition. And I think I just want to articulate that, because I think there's this way in which we can give a lot of specificity to 47 in terms of the many different experiences of different geographies that Sam was talking about, the many other interlocutors of this experience, including the British, as well as others that we draw upon, we must draw upon to think with. But here's why I think Gandhi refused to acquiesce to partition. Because ultimately partition is a colonial concept. Not just a divide and rule colonial concept, but it's also a European conception of the nation state that gets imposed upon us. And it is a concept that says that the multi-religious plural worlds, where modalities of living together with differences had been forged over centuries, are now suddenly untenable. And it declares that some differences are so incommensurate that it demands that we cleave these shared worlds apart, no matter what the cost and no matter how much destruction and violence it takes. And so when we think with this concept, when we recuperate these stories, when we tell them, insist on telling these stories of partition, right? And it's not simply a matter of breaking the silence. It's not simply telling the stories so that we can pass them down to the generations, because we are living with them, whether they're told, whether they're spoken or not. It is in a way to recuperate this plurality that was once lived by those who still carry its pain, its burden, right? It was lived, and to refuse the incommensurability that partition demanded. And we must continue as such to do this work, be it through Dastaan or the writing of different texts. It's striking to me that, all of you are continue to do this work. And I get students who are even, they're even more removed from 47 per se. And yet this sense of loss that lives with them, that leads them to examine and explore it is this loss of a multi-religious world that was rendered untenable. I want to say one more thing, because one of the things, of course, my work has been doing oral history work with largely Muslims, both in Iran and Pakistan. And partition affects Muslims. We live with it in a particular way, which I think needs to be articulated because it affects everyone for that reason. Let's just say that in this plural world, this multi-religious world, one might have imagined Muslims were an integral part of the very formation of the plural ideas of India. But in acquiescing to partition, it meant that they then became outsiders to it. Anti-colonial struggles fought hard against precisely this kind of colonial idea. This political conception of the world, which one could say is an imperial conception of the world. And even though we turn to the Indian constitution that writes a constitution in spite of this, right? But acceding to partition, this newfound incommensurability meant that everything that appeared Muslim, its cleaving apart was set in motion. And so partitions were taking place within nation states, ongoing. And there was, if this incommensurability of Muslims within the idea of India was put in crisis, in Pakistan there was a dereliction almost immediately in trying to figure out what it meant to be Muslim without the plurality of the worlds in which it had been formed. You know, the plural worlds were integral to any conception of what it means to be Muslim. And this had also been taken away. So whether Muslims stayed where they were or migrated, were displaced, in both cases, their worlds were overturned. Now this incommensurability has implications, I think, for all kinds of thinking about all kinds of plural lives, plural worlds that we must in some way continue demand and accountability.
Well, I think one of the things that was really clear in your book is that you make a distinction between migration and displacement, you know, within the Muslim population as well. And you go very much into detail about things like property, evacuee property, land ownership of that land, longing for land left behind, and also what the state did just post-partition with fermenting the sense of citizenship and identity, which I think is fascinating. And it's very interesting how, you know, last year I got into an argument with someone. In fact, it wasn't an argument, I shouldn't say that. It was at the British Library. It was at an event at the British Library, and someone told me that partition was done and dusted with, which I'm sure all of us on this panel have heard multiple times. And it was very interesting because the revocation of article of Kashmir had just happened a few days earlier. And she said to me that, you know, young people like you, partition is done. I don't know why you keep harking about the past. You keep digging up old graves. You should write on Kashmir. And it just clicked in my head that you can't write about an event without understanding the origin of that event. And Kashmir is just one example of you know, the links that have been drawn since partition.
So I know the Long Partition is the book I wrote, and it was determined at the time. It's been more than a decade since that book came out, and was determined at the time to give that kind of specificity. It has all this specificity, right, of what happened, because that question of what happened was seen something that still needed a lot of accounting for. Sorry, this is
Karachi, yeah, of course, traffic.
It still needed an accounting for, but now in the decade sense, what I feel like I have a little bit more clarity and a little bit more courage to say that partition didn't begin in June 3rd, or I mean, we're always looking for a date when partition seems inevitable, right? As the origin for, and I know Sam, you've chosen 1937. I don't know, Kavita, where you begin with telling the story. Where do we begin with telling the story? Because it is something that has history in many different geographies across the 20th century, when the nation-state idea, European conception of the nation-state, is then globalized. And you see, this is a particular conception that gets imposed in the Indian subcontinent as a solution of sorts. I don't know where we would go for a beginning, but what we also know is that it's like, it's something that demands continuous reproduction. And it demands continuous reproduction. It's an unending process. If it's not in one space, it's in another. If it's not in one life, it's in another. And we see this, Kashmir being one, but then the citizenship laws becomes another. Right. The forms of everyday violence, right, escalating. Escalating. Both India and
what I would say, Vazira, is I completely agree. I think, and that's the thing, is people think partition is a historical event. Well, I mean, it is a historical event. It happened on a date in 1947, but it's so present when you speak to people. And that is one of the things that I took from my interviews. And I know Aanchal and Sam, we've talked about this, but when you interview people who lived through that time, they don't talk about borders, about division, about partition. They just talk about their lands, wherever that land was. And if you ask them today, you know, who are you? Where are you from? They will always start with the land of their birth. And that is the thing that I took away from all of it, is that absolute visceral attachment to the land of their birth, even if they'd never been back in over 70 years. It is absolutely who they are. And Vazira, you're right. That sense of attachment has persisted through the ages. You know, Aanchal and I always talk about this. I feel a really strong attachment to Lahore. I have never been there. It is. I'm attached to a memory, an inherited memory from my father. By the way, he never went back after he left as well. But that is very much in me, and I have passed that on to my children. Now, I don't know how many generations that will persist for, but right now it's very alive. But then there is a counter to that is also very alive, which is the national narratives on the Indian subcontinent, which strangely, or not strangely, is quite counter to the partition generation and counter to the stories that they tell you. And so I fear that when that generation is dead, and they give you a much more complex view of what India was, British India was like, how, as you say, Vazira, people live side by side with all their differences and all that messiness. They live like that. You know, your land could be more important than your religion. You shared more in perhaps language or culture or traditions. When they die, they can't then counter the national narratives that is now being perpetuated, which is why it's important to record their memories and their testimonies, because after that, other people will try and rewrite that history.
I want to put Sam in, actually. Sam, I've been thinking a lot of public memory of partition, and also thinking about your new proposal that shows a completely different side of partition. It talks of many different partitions, and you, as Vazira said, you begin with 1937 and you extend all the way to 71 to the liberation. Can you give us a sense of these different frontiers that you're looking at?
Yeah. So yeah, one of the things that increasingly struck me, particularly when I began researching the Northeast, was that for the Northeast, this was the second partition within a decade. Only in 1937 were they cut off from Burma. And that was very much to do with the Burmese nationalist movement, because Burma was completely part of British India, as were places like Aden in modern-day Yemen. Huge swathes of Yemen were part of British India. Yemen was part of Bombay province. And a lot of the Gulf states, Qatar, Oman, UAE, were treated by the Raj as princely states. They were all given awards of the British Order. They all had representatives in the British Raj in New Delhi. And with 37 was the first time that a kind of huge land border struck off a big part of that. And so you get, you know, a border going through the Naga Hills, and you get Naga communities in both the northeastern India and northwestern Burma. And you get the Rohingya, who are this community who speak a kind of dialect of Bengali, who were protesting for Pakistan, who suddenly are deprived of Pakistan. You know, they're on the wrong side of that border. And the same year, 37, you also get the Yemeni bit lobbed off and turned into its own little colony as well. And so for me, it wasn't so much that the kind of partition with Pakistan became inevitable during 37, but that, you know, it was the first major cut. Another one you could say was maybe Afghanistan, but that was 100 years earlier, and it was at best a kind of vaguely protected territory when the British went in there. This was, you know, a full part of what India was. And Gandhi and Tagore all go on holidays to Rangoon, you know, stuff like that. And so I talk about 5 partitions. First, the partition of Burma and Aden. Secondly, the Great Partition that we all know much more about. Third, the partition of princely India, because 2/3 of what's now India wasn't ever ruled by the British at all. It was independent kingdoms, and actually only 19% of the modern Indo-Pakistani border was ever drawn by Radcliffe. The rest was drawn by the decisions of Maharajas, of Nawabs, of Nizams, and obviously the idea that it was going to be separate states was created by the British. But I find that the agency of these characters has somehow disappeared in the 70 years since. And so, for example, Jodhpur state almost joined Pakistan, and we would have a very different shaped country had that happened. Junagadh state did, and then the Indian army went in. We all know what happened in Kashmir. So that's the third partition. The fourth one was the separation of the Gulf states, which, you know, Gwadar, which is now in Pakistan, was Omani. It belonged to Oman. And across the Gulf, you know, there were huge Indian communities because they were all princely states. And that was all separated between 47, and 56. And they all became independent states thereafter. And then the final one, of course, is when Pakistan itself is turned into two, like when Bangladeshi independence basically happens, when two nations emerge there. And that's the last major moment of border shifting, really, with the exception of Sikkim joining India. It's the last time that there's a division. And so for me, that's why I think I chose 37 and 71. It kind of made sense, 34 years, where 5 different types of divisions happen, most of which we kind of get lost somehow.
But unfortunately, a lot of the repercussions of which are being felt today as well.
The Rohingya crisis, only this afternoon, there was 2 Burmese generals who, you know, basically admitted to The Hague about the war crimes that they committed in the army. And now that whole Rohingya crisis is very much dates from the Burmese partition, where, you know, these were considered Indians or Pakistanis, but not Burmese. And Burma, throughout its dictatorship, came up with a list of native communities who didn't come from India, essentially, so that they could determine who was native to Burma and who'd come over during the colonial period.
And you know, we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'm being sent messages. Yes.
Quick question of Sam, which is like you're thinking about when you say 5 partitions in terms of territorial partitions, right? When borders are drawn and territories carved up. But in each of these stories, you know, there's all the ways in which the lists that are drawn up, as we were speaking of Burma, and the ethnic cleansings that they that they set in motion, these become far, they proceed and continue. This is the ways in which the territorial drawing on the map becomes so much more, right? Becomes so much more. And in a way, the oral history work in that sense needs to be continuous, because it is a continuously unfolding sets of violence and displacement of the Rohingya.
And this is something that's surprising me. It's just, we think of, as you said, like, partition histories having been recorded already. But the fact that Burma was even part of the Indian subcontinent until a decade before partition surprises so many people that I meet, even though all the maps that you see of British India have Burma. It's there from the beginning of the Raj. It's not like, and it's visually there all the time, but everyone thinks, oh yeah, but it was just kind of, maybe administratively, but no, there are numerous Burmese dynasties that occupied Assam. The Ahom language in northeast India that was part of Assam was a dialect of Thai. So, the connections between Southeast Asia and South Asia, all these different nation states come into being already. And so we forget the levels of connection that existed, not even just pre-colonialism, but during colonialism. Why are there so many Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, or Desis, because they didn't subscribe to any of these nationalities, but in Kenya, in South Africa, it was a very connected world. And I think interrogating that is important. Questioning your grandma is important.
We have been cut off officially. I know the thing with partition panels is that they can go on forever.
Yeah.
Really can.
There are things of mutual interest. But I want to thank all of you for joining in from wherever you are at the moment. Sam and Kavita, of course, we speak a lot. But Vazira, it's been a pleasure to have you on the panel and meet you this way and hear you talk about your work. And of course, thank you so much for being a part of JLF London. And over to JLF now.
Thank you so much, Aanchal, and thank you everyone, lovely speakers, Kavita, Sam, and Vazira. Thank you very, very much. And of course, thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We would also like to thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation UK, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation, for supporting us. We hope that you will stay with us for all our remaining sessions today and will join us tomorrow for a whole day of fabulous sessions. Our next session that will begin shortly is In Search of the Anarchy, Treasures of the East India Company from the India Office Collection of the British Library. William Dalrymple and Malini Roy, introduced by Sanjay Roy.